Hello, my name is Jim Graham. I'd like to tell you about an experience that I had during World War II as a guinea pig in an experiment in semi-starvation. During the war, there was a lot of concern for the people in Europe who were starving, not just those in prison camps and concentration camps, but also the general population who were suffering from food shortages. In making plans for relief activities after the war, there were a lot of questions that needed answers. What do you feed a starving person to bring him or her back to health? What's the most economical use of food materials when supplies are severely limited? We knew fairly well what a starved person looked like and what starvation did to the human body. But until this time, there had never been an opportunity to measure exactly what changes take place in the body under starvation conditions. Nor had there ever been any scientific test to determine what best to feed a starved person to bring him or her back to health. So, Dr. Ansel Keys, who was director of the Laboratory of Physiological Hygiene at the University of Minnesota, proposed an experiment lasting 1 year using volunteers from among the several thousand conscientious objectors doing alternative public service throughout the United States. I was one of those conscientious objectors. Early in 1944, a call went out for volunteers for those of us who were working in various civilian public service projects. I had already spent a couple of years with the Forest Service, planting trees and fighting forest fires. This call for volunteers sounded like an opportunity to provide a worthwhile service, not just to our country, but to all humanity. I was one of more than 100 volunteers. Of those 100, 40 were selected to go to Minneapolis for clinical tests and interviews, and I was one of the final 36 chosen to take part in the experiment. The criteria for selection were: 1, we had to be in good health and free from chronic diseases or disabling defects. 2, we had to be in good mental health. 3, we had to be able to get along with others under periods of stress. And lastly, we had to have an interest in studying and preparing ourselves for relief and rehabilitation work after the war. In the middle of November 1944, we 36 reported to the University of Minnesota in Minneapolis. We were shown to our quarters where we were to live for the next year, located under one wing of the university stadium. Here on the upper floor, we had our dormitory-style sleeping quarters, a comfortable lounge, a library, and classrooms. On the ground floor, the Laboratory of Physiological Hygiene had all of its equipment, testing rooms, treadmills, chemical analysis labs, and so forth. Our meals were taken at a cafeteria of one of the residence halls a little over a mile away. The experiment itself was divided into 3 parts. First, 12 weeks of normal diet, then 24 weeks of semi-starvation, and ending with 12 weeks of rehabilitation, a total of 48 weeks, just 4 weeks short of a full year. During the first 3 months of the control period, the standardization period, we were all on the same diet, but with different amounts according to the individual body requirements. The amounts were carefully measured to determine how much each of us normally needed. I started out at about 3,500 calories a day, which you might think would be enough for someone my size. I'm 6'2" and normally weigh about 175 pounds. But even at that level, I lost weight because I was fairly active. One of my hobbies is folk dancing, which I taught regularly at a local church. Furthermore, this was the middle of winter, so I was into all the winter sports, especially ice skating. Since I was losing weight, they kept increasing my food allotment. At the end of the 12 weeks, I was at 3,700 calories a day and still losing weight, but not so rapidly. All this time, we were expected to participate in our normal activities, sports activities, social activities, and we were expected to do 15 hours of assigned work in the laundry or maintenance work, clerical work, or in the chemical lab. We were expected to carry on an educational program, studying, preparing ourselves for relief and rehabilitation work after the war, and this included taking some courses at the university, as well as special classes that were given in the laboratory. At the end of the control period, after being on the same diet for 3 months, we were put through 2 weeks of tests and measurements. These were the same tests that would be repeated at intervals throughout the experiment. They measured everything you could imagine. They measured height, weight, chest size, stomach size, blood volume, and specific gravity. You get specific gravity by weighing underwater in the swimming pool. They measured eyesight, hand-eye coordination, bone density, lung capacity, and capacity for work. They took blood samples, urine samples, stool samples, sperm samples, and bone marrow samples. They did electrocardiograms and skin biopsies and measured our basal metabolism. They observed the functioning of the stomach by feeding us a bowl of oatmeal laced with barium sulfate, and then following its progress by X-ray and fluoroscope. They measured the tendency towards fainting using a tilt table. They measured movement during sleep. In addition to all these physiological tests, we were given various psychological tests. And I should point out that throughout the experiment, we had weekly meetings with a psychologist, and each of us kept a diary. After going through all the tests and determining our normal measurements and normal body functions, on February 12, 1945, we began our 24 weeks of semi-starvation. Only 2 meals a day from now on, and only 3 daily menus. Number 1 on Monday, number 2 on Tuesday, number 3 on Wednesday, and start over again with number 1 on Thursday, and so forth. The diet was designed to represent as nearly as possible the food found in Central European countries during famine. We had whole wheat, bread, potatoes, cereals, and lots of turnips and cabbage. Only token amounts of meats and dairy products. The average daily intake was 1,570 calories, and that included about 50 grams of protein and 30 grams of fat. The 1,570 calories was an average. Some of us had less, some had more. We were expected to lose about 1/4 of our body weight during the next 6 months. Each of us was assigned a weight loss goal and given a graph showing the rate at which we were expected to lose weight. We were expected to lose weight fairly rapidly at first, and then it would level off towards the ends of 6 months. Each morning we were weighed, and if we were losing weight too fast, we'd be assigned extra bread and potatoes. Or if we were not losing weight fast enough, our allotment of bread and potatoes was reduced. At the beginning, this was a rather interesting experience. We were losing weight, of course, but for the first few weeks, we still had quite a bit of energy. We were expected to continue all activities as before, to the extent that we could. We had to walk a minimum of 22 miles per week, plus a half hour on the treadmill each week. We had to spend 15 hours a week on our assigned jobs at the lab, and of course, keep up our classes. It wasn't long, however, before we began losing our will to do anything that required energy. The days began to drag out, each day getting longer and longer, and there seemed to be no end of starvation in sight. 6 months seemed like forever. Each morning we would get up, step on the scales, and check our weight against the chart of expected weight loss to see if maybe we might be entitled to some extra bread and potatoes. I'd look in the mirror and see that my eyes looked hollow, my cheeks were only a thin covering for the bones in my face, and my hair was getting thinner. If I tried to smile, it was just a grimace. I didn't feel like smiling in the first place, and I never laughed. My muscles were almost gone, my bones protruded, and sitting on a hard chair was uncomfortable, even for a few minutes. Most of us carried around pillows to sit on. I couldn't walk up a flight of stairs without stopping to rest once or twice on the way up. I felt like an old man, and probably looked like one, since I made no effort to stand up straight. I thought about food all the time. I started collecting cookbooks, you know, the kind with beautiful color pictures of delicious-looking dishes. I felt cold all the time, even though it was the middle of summer. Nothing felt better than to find a nice warm spot in the sunshine and do nothing but lie there and soak up the heat of the sun. Luckily, we had been able to do our ice skating when we felt strong, and the worst of the starvation was in the middle of summer. Most of us suffered from edema, the collecting of liquid in the body, some more than others. I always woke up in the morning with my face puffy on the side I was lying on. Sometimes my ankles and knees were puffy, but my edema was not as bad as that of several others whose flesh bulged over their shoes by the end of the day. We became very irritable and intolerant. Little things seemed to annoy us. We were no longer polite with each other or with visitors. It seemed as if the veneer of civilization had been removed, leaving bare the animal underneath. We didn't enjoy having guests because it was an effort to entertain them, and we were not usually very diplomatic about showing our feelings about it. Food occupied our thoughts all the time. At mealtime, each one had his special way of dealing with the food. A couple of the fellows would eat their food quickly and then leave the cafeteria and try to forget about it. Most of the rest of us dawdled over our food. Some would mix their food all together. Others would savor each bite of each item on the plate. We'd been told before the experiment that the food might become monotonous, since there were only 3 menus. But it was far from monotonous. It was food, and any food tasted good. To this day, I find one of the tastiest foods is a simple boiled potato. It's delicious. Any food looked good. Even the dirty crusts of bread in the street looked appetizing, and we envied the fat pigeons picking at them. Wasting food was a crime. We felt the waste of food in restaurants was intolerable. About 2 months into the semi-starvation period, one of the participants broke down. He was coming back from a walk downtown. One of our measured routes for our required 22 miles per week was downtown Minneapolis and back. On the way back one day, he lost his self-control, stopped at an ice cream shop for a dish of ice cream. Once he'd started, he couldn't stop. He went on an eating binge. A little further down the street, he stopped again for an ice cream sundae. And then after that, it was a series of sundaes and malted milks before returning to the lab to report that he had broken the diet and would have to be removed from the program. The next day, we established a buddy system. From that time onward, we never left the lab except in the company of another participant or a member of the staff. Those who were working in the kitchen asked to be assigned to other jobs. One of the first effects of semi-starvation was the loss of interest in women. A couple of the fellows continued to date longer than the rest of us, but we found out afterwards they were having a sort of competition to see who could last the longest. They weren't really interested in the girls. Sometimes we'd go to the movies, but even that became more of an effort than it was worth. The best parts contained scenes of people eating. If the picture was funny, we couldn't laugh, and the love scenes were absolutely boring. The human body is a marvelous machine. It adjusts itself automatically to a lower food intake. Body weight reduces, of course, but also heart size, lung capacity, stomach size. Everything slows down, particularly the metabolism rate. But the changes we noticed most were psychological changes. Tests showed that our mental ability did not change significantly. We still had the ability to solve mental problems, but our will to make the effort to solve intellectual problems was very low. About halfway through the semi-starvation period, we were given a relief dinner. Instead of 2 meals, we had just one that day. The total calories for that day was about 2,300 calories. We'd been asked what menu we would like to have, and we were served a delicious meal of chicken and dressing with potatoes and gravy and a lot of other things. And we ended up with strawberry shortcake for dessert. That night, we suddenly discovered that everybody was getting up in the night to urinate. In the morning, we all weighed in several pounds lighter. Apparently, the extra protein from the chicken dinner had triggered the loss of body fluids that were causing edema. A few days later, we were all back to our pre-relief meal weights, but wondering how much we really weighed. As we approached the end of the semi-starvation period, our spirits rose. On July 29, 1945, was the day semi-starvation was to end, and we were to begin eating again. It was also my 23rd birthday. For the rehabilitation period, we were divided into 4 groups. The lowest group received an additional 400 calories, the second group an additional 800 calories, the third group 1,200 calories, and the highest group received 1,600 calories in addition to the average 1,570 that we had been receiving. So now the 4 groups range from a little under 2,000 calories to 3,170 for the highest group. To find out the importance of proteins and vitamins in the rehabilitation of persons who have starved, our groups were further subdivided so that some received a protein supplement and some did not. Some received a multiple vitamin pill every day, and the rest received a placebo. That is, a pill with no vitamins in it. Morale was high for a few days, but that did not last long when we discovered that the food we were getting was not enough to satisfy hunger, and we were not even beginning to gain weight. In fact, for the first few weeks, we lost weight as pounds of edema fluids were being replaced by healthy flesh. Signs of recovery were so slow in coming that we became even more despondent than during semi-starvation. Therefore, after 6 weeks, our food rations were increased another 800 calories. Now the 4 groups averaged 2,700, 3,170, 3,570, and 3,970 calories per day. Even those getting nearly 4,000 calories gained weight very slowly. By the end of 3 months' rehabilitation, none of us had yet reached normal weight. The war came to an end while we were still in the experiment. Germany surrendered in May, and Japan surrendered in August. Our experiment didn't end until October. Thousands of starved people were being released from concentration camps and prison camps. Questions were being urgently asked about the best ways to feed these people. Unfortunately, Dr. Keyes could only give tentative answers based on preliminary results of the experiment. Definite answers would have to wait until our experiment ended in October. The first conclusions announced by Dr. Keyes was that the starved people of Europe and Asia must be rehabilitated physically before talking to them about democracy, a reference to the psychological effects of starvation. He also said that the Minnesota experiment showed that supplements of vitamins or proteins were not necessary. Here I'm quoting Dr. Keyes in a speech he made in Chicago. Enough food must be supplied to allow tissues destroyed during starvation to be rebuilt. Our experiments have shown that in an adult man, no appreciable rehabilitation can take place on a diet of 2,000 calories a day. The proper level is more like 4,000 calories for some months. The character of the rehabilitation diet is also important, but unless calories are abundant, then extra proteins and minerals are of little value. End quote. These were generalizations while the experiment was just coming to a close. The medical staff spent the next 3 or 4 years analyzing the extensive data collected and published the final report in 1950, almost 5 years later. The report is over 1,300 pages in 2 thick volumes. It gives all the details of the changes that took place in our bodies, physical, chemical, and biological, but it also showed that the greatest changes were psychological. Depression and apathy changed more than body weight. After the experiment was over, I was still hungry for a long time. Even when I could eat all I wanted, I would finish a meal and still feel hungry. My stomach just would not hold anymore. For months I carried candy bars or cookies in my pocket and munched continually. Naturally, I got fat. In 6 months, I went from a low of 122 pounds to a high of 225 pounds. It took me 3 years to get back to normal weight and normal eating habits. In conclusion, I would like to say that I have experienced hunger and the apathy and depression that goes with it. But we lived in sanitary quarters under the constant care of doctors. Most people in areas of famine die of other diseases because of the body's inability to resist disease. Furthermore, we knew that it would all be over on a certain date. I often think how horrible it would be to be starving and never know when it would end, if ever.